Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to BSMS Wilderness Medicine's first online Zoom webinar of the year. Our first event, we've got Dr Sophie Redlin, who is a GP in London, and she's also had lots of experience as an expedition medic. She's also a fellow of the Royal Geographical Society, and she's a former mental health trainer. She's done lots of qualitative research during her out of program experience, in which she travelled to remote Scotland, Norway, the US and Japan. She's also taught as faculty with World Extreme Medicine and has more recently worked as the ship doctor on an expedition to Antarctica. So really massive thank you to Dr. Sophie Redlin for joining us today, and I'm really excited for your talk.
Thank you. Right, I will try and share my screen. Thank you. Yeah, I was sharing with Eleanor how I was doing a talk a few months ago where someone actually managed to write on my slide while I was doing it. So that was a little bit off-putting. Anyway, hi everyone. As Eleanor says, my name's Sophie. I'm really happy to be here with you all this evening, and I can't believe there's so many of you. That's fantastic. Clearly not everyone in the world has Zoom fatigue, so that's a really good sign. I'm sorry this is only two-dimensional, but I'll try and make it as engaging as I can for you. I'm a little bit alarmed that I'm apparently old enough to be imparting stories and advice around expedition medicine, but I'm looking forward to sharing a bit of my story with you. And my aim really this evening is to tell you my story, and through my story, give you maybe a few tips for things that might help as you go forwards. But it's by no means gospel truth. It only comes from my kind of small, kind of humble experience. And basically, I just want to give you guys a bit of hope and inspiration and confirmation that you have definitely chosen the right career. It's a fantastic career. So yeah, let me share some stories with you. And just to say, I will try and cover as much as I can in my talk, but if you do have questions, please do feel free to ask them at the end. We can either do it through chat or through Eleanor or whatever works. And equally, feel free to message me afterwards. So what's my story? Beginning of my story? Well, my story starts in the Yorkshire Dales. I grew up there. And from anyone who's from the north of England or from countryside areas, you'll know that it's very difficult to grow up somewhere like that and not be outdoorsy. So I was very active and outdoorsy from an early age, often kind of throwing myself into Yorkshire reservoirs off a sailing dinghy without a wetsuit on and crazy stuff like that. I was also very keen on medicine from an early age, like I'm sure many of you. And my parents tell this sort of hilarious anecdote that at the age of 6, I was caught on camera telling family members I was going to be a pediatric heart surgeon. I don't know where I got that idea from, but that was what came to mind. So very interested from an early age. And I suppose the qualities that maybe stood me in good stead for being an expedition medic was that even as a child, I could never sit still. I was always into the next project or the next activity, and I was always very determined. So I was always finding ways to fit things in to after school and holidays. And as you'll see, that definitely set me up to be an expedition medic later on in life. But my first real adventure was actually my first expedition. So I was 17 when I joined my first expedition, not as a medic, but as a participant. And this was an expedition with the Yorkshire Schools Exploring Society that few schools took part in. And it was following the Lewis and Clark Trail across the US. So the Lewis and Clark Trail is a route that goes from Missouri near the east coast of the US all the way to the west coast in Oregon. And it was a trail that was pioneered by 2 army generals back in the days when the US was being settled by the white man. And they traveled by canoe, on foot, and had many adventures along the way. So at the age of 17, I joined a group and we kind of recovered their tracks. on horseback, on foot, over the course of about 6 weeks. And it really was, it still is one of the most incredible things I've ever done. It was my first taste of proper adventure, my first taste of sleeping under the stars, of cooking my own food, of, you know, going to the toilet in the bush, all that kind of stuff. And it really kind of gave me the bug, I guess, for that kind of travel and that kind of adventure. It was also my first experience of expedition medicine. And it's quite a funny story, but the medic accompanying this expedition was a retired GP. And in honesty, I think he'd come along on this trip thinking he was going to get an easy ride. I mean, this was America, you know, it was all very civilized. What was going to go wrong? And as it happened, on this particular expedition, they had more accidents and injuries than I think they'd ever had in the whole history of Yorkshire Schools Exploring Society. So it was not a holiday for him. And I think everything that could go wrong did go wrong on that trip. And maybe afterwards I can tell you a few of those stories. I then went off to university at the stage where you guys are now. I was at St Andrews for 3 years. So we do kind of split clinical and preclinical. So I did my preclinical years at St Andrews and then went on to Manchester for 3 years. I don't need to tell you guys this, university is such an awesome time for exploring both what you're interested in work-wise, but also kind of outdoor activities, other interests. So I got very into sailing at St Andrews, and it was just an incredible time to explore who you are as a person, I guess. So this is where the advice bit kicks in. As I say, this is very much taken from my own experience. So please don't be patronized at all by it, but it may be helpful. So a medical school, as I say, it's a fantastic time to experiment in whatever way you interpret that. But in terms of expedition medicine and wilderness medicine, it's a great to start taking opportunities to explore that. And it sounds like a lot of you have been doing that already. And a lot of people ask me at my stage now, you know, what would you recommend I do? I'm at university. How can I kind of get ahead of the game or get some experience? And the first thing that I would say to you all is just to relax. So I think there's a kind of big myth in medicine that you have to decide very early what you want to do, which route you want to take, whether that's specialty or where you want to be, etc. And, you know, that there are certain career paths that require that dedication for sure. And there will be some of you, I'm sure, in the audience who decided at the age of 3 that you wanted to be a neurosurgeon. And I respect you hugely. We definitely need good neurosurgeons. But for the rest of you, I'd encourage you just to stay really, really open to lots of things. Because if you don't, A, life can get boring quite quickly if you're only getting experience in one area. And B, you might miss out on some really cool experiences. So stay open and really use your time at medical school. Some of you, I know that's coming to an end now, but for those of you who are a bit earlier on, really use it. You'll never again have such long holidays or those kind of months and chunks of time that you can kind of throw yourself into. So do use the time. What I would say is try and use the time wisely. And I can use an example from my own experience for this. I think it was my school holiday of my 2nd year at St Andrews. I chose that I wanted to save up that summer and go away and do something and get experience in something kind of global health wise. And I worked as a healthcare assistant at a local hospital in the summer. So I must have worked solidly for 3 months, you know, doing days and nights and saving all my money up. And then the money I had at the end was enough to pay for 2 weeks work experience in Ghana. So I went out there at the end of the summer. And in honesty, you know, Ghana was amazing, but in honesty, I paid an awful lot of money to basically be put in pretty awful accommodation and be introduced to one person in a hospital, and that was it. And I then had to sort of find my own way for the rest of the time. So there are a lot of schemes and things out there that are advertised to, you know, give people experience and ask you to pay a lot of money for the privilege. So all I'd say is just think about the opportunities that come your way and think about whether A, you want to do it, and B, whether it's going to be useful for you later on. But there are some really good things that you can start doing early on, especially in this kind of line of work. Now, I don't know if any of you have heard of Wilderness Medical Training. I'm sure you have. They're a really sort of reputable company now who organise fantastic courses covering expedition medicine in all kinds of environments, first responder courses, that kind of thing. One of their very popular courses is in Chamonix in the Alps every year. They run an expedition medicine course in the winter, and it is absolutely fantastic. It's a perfect combination of fantastic lectures on expedition medicine, but also inspirational talks from their faculty. And then obviously skiing the rest of the time. So it's a win-win situation. So I suppose when I'm kind of suggesting to you to think about which opportunities you take, these kind of courses are things that you can do before you qualify as a doctor. They're really accessible and applicable, so they'll make a lot of sense to you. And also it does sort of stand you in good stead going forwards. So medicine, like everything in life, is a little bit of a game of what have you done, what haven't you done. So I would never say to do something you don't want to do just to get it on your CV. But I would say if you can do something you enjoy and it kind of looks good in a few years that you've done it, then definitely go for it. The poster just that you can see on the right hand side there was the course actually runs a conference at the same time. So I went to the course the first year in 2018, and then the following year actually went back and presented a poster in the conference. And again, it's just a way of kind of getting your name out there, building some networks, just kind of showing enthusiasm when willing. And I think it definitely did stand me in good stead. Okay, so on to foundation years. I can't see any of you, so I'm hoping everyone's enjoying this, but that's totally fine. So on to foundation years. So I left university and obviously applied for F1, and I went to Bath. So I moved south, migrated south, and I was telling some of the guys before we started, I ended up at the RUH, which is a sort of medium-sized DGH in Bath. And it really was a fantastic 2 years. You know, it's hard work. Everyone will tell you, you know, it's miserable in some ways, but it's a really good time to kind of get a grounding in medicine, get really good at your skills, and begin to think about what you want to do next. So I guess advice around kind of expedition medicine at this stage of your life, the first thing I would say is try to accept what is and isn't in your control. So when you start working, and particularly when you start working as a junior doctor, there's going to be a lot that isn't in your control, unfortunately. So your jobs, you have to do certain jobs. You're going to be on a certain kind of rota. You're going to be working certain weekends when you'd rather be not working. So it's not a time to beat yourself up that you're not getting the real experience that you want to get. It's a time to work hard, as I say, learn your stuff, and the stuff that's going to be really important when you're an expedition medic in 5 years. You're going to need to be able to cannulate people pretty well. So just take that time and kind of enjoy it for what it is. But there are ways of doing things alongside the day job. And this is kind of theme is going to play into my kind of lingering message for you all, is that in medicine, and the same applies for all of life, you really have to go out and get things if you want them. No one's going to give it to you. And certainly in your foundation years, no one's going to make it easy for you to go and do extra things. So if you want to go and do the Chamonix course when you're in F1, go to the Rota Master early, make it happen, and you'll get there. So there are ways of doing it. You just have to be really, really proactive. And then, of course, you come to choosing a specialty, that exciting stage. And again, I'm sure there's many of you who know already what you want to do. I know that I was probably sitting in your position, gosh, probably as early as my first or second year of university. and I was absolutely certain I was going to do surgery. I'd always wanted to do surgery. At that point, I wasn't limited to pediatric heart surgery, but that was what I wanted to do. And if I'm honest, it was only really coming to F1 and F2 and doing those jobs that really changed for me. So that's why I'd say to you just to kind of stay a bit open. It's really great to have passions and to have things that you're excited about and that you want to pursue. But remember that you don't really know what something's going to be like until you get there. And so as an F1 standing in theatre, although I wasn't a surgeon standing in theatre, I was able to, for the first time, really observe what it was like to work in that environment, to be late home every night, to have to stay and do that extra appendix because you needed to look keen and kind of get ahead. So for me personally, those 2 years were actually F1 and F2 quite conflicting, in that it was a time when I really began to doubt, you know, this love of surgery. And the main reason was that I found that my priority was actually to have flexibility, to have the ability to work wherever I wanted to in the world, in the country, to have a job where I could potentially get locum work fairly easily. And actually I found that what I really loved about medicine was talking to patients and hearing patient stories. And although of course surgeons get to do that in a variety of ways, I actually found it probably wasn't the specialty for me for a number of reasons. So I obviously chose general practice. That's been my journey, and that's not something I ever thought I would do. I was sitting at your stage at university, and I think they asked us one day who wanted to be a GP out of the whole group, about 100 of us in the lecture theatre. And, you know, maybe 10 people put their hands up. And I was thinking, God, you know, that's dull. Who would want to do that? It's turned out to be the best thing I ever did. I'm not here to persuade you all to become GPs, but it's certainly given me the flexibility I wanted. And if you look on the right-hand side, it's sort of, these are just a few of the things I've been able to do through general practice. So obviously expedition medicine, research, even becoming a bit of a sort of novice filmmaker as well. So main message is think about what's important for you. Don't just be led on a sense of what you think you should be doing. Really think about the life that you want as well. GP also helped me develop an interest in mental health, particularly, as I say, around kind of patient stories and mental health globally. And that's what sort of led me to do what I did next. So this is a bit of an odd slide, isn't it? But this is a really, really important slide for me, and one that I hope will kind of resonate with all of you guys. Medical school and medical training can often feel very much like a conveyor belt. And that's partly because you're shipped from A to B and you're told, you know, the next 6 months you'll be here, the next 6 months you'll be here. But it's also, I think, very much the ethos of medicine that you get on the ladder and you go all the way to the top and you don't take any diversions, otherwise something terrible will happen. And I'm sure, I hope you don't feel like that, but I certainly did feel like that when I was at your stage, and even later than that. And I suppose what I really, really want to tell you today very clearly is that you can step off the conveyor belt and there are ways and means of doing that in a kind of sensible, timely way. And B, you sort of have to step off that conveyor belt at times if you want to take up some of the really fun opportunities in this world. They don't always come along at the right time when you've just finished or you've got a gap. It can sometimes mean thinking out of the box, being a bit unconventional, that leads to the best experiences. So advice bit number 6, don't be afraid to step off that conveyor belt. And if ever anyone's afraid and you need someone to champion for you, just give me a shout. Be unconventional. It's the unconventional people in this world that have done amazing things. And as I say, there are ways and means of doing that that aren't going to mean you don't end up with a consultant job or whatever people would like to tell you. I'm now going to show you some lovely photographs just in case anyone's fallen asleep, because this bit will normally get people excited again. And this really is just to show you that I wouldn't have been to any of these places if I hadn't had the courage to step off that conveyor belt and be a bit unconventional. So this picture is of Fukushima in Japan, where I was doing some research. This beautiful picture is of the Highlands in Scotland, if you can believe it, in April. This is, of course, the South Shetland Islands in Antarctica. This again is Scotland. I'm here at this point on a British exploring expedition with young people. This is the Grand Canyon in Arizona. I was here again doing research. And this is Antarctica. And yes, that is a real iceberg. Okay. I'm going to show you a very short video. I apologize if the quality isn't very good, kind of coming through Zoom. There isn't actually any sound to it. It's just something I put together quickly to show you something that I'd been up to. So don't worry about the sound. And it's really just to give you a little bit more information about a project that I did during my GP training, just to make the point for you that this was the first time that I'd really been a bit unconventional and stepped off that ladder, stepped off that conveyor belt. And this project was about mental health and communities across the world. During my GP training, I became really interested in how we help people who are suffering with distress, and potentially how our communities and the breakdown of our communities have led to a rise in mental health problems. And so I really wanted to explore this more, and I wanted to see how different communities around the world handled mental health. And true to form, true to my reputation, I couldn't sit still. I needed to do it now. I couldn't wait until the end of my GP training to do it. So I took time out and I did it during my training. So I'll just show you the video and then I'll talk a little bit more about it.
Do you think that happens usually in Japan?
Okay. You can see a little bit of my novice filmmaking there. So yes, this project that became this huge journey was something I sort of dreamt up and designed myself. So I designed a qualitative research study, managed to somehow get a professor from Imperial on board who helped me with it. And as Eleanor said at the beginning, I traveled to the US, to the Orkney Islands, to Norway and to Japan across the course of a year, and spent that year interviewing doctors, interviewing patients, immersing myself in communities to explore this relationship between community and mental health. Now, this wasn't a traditional expedition, as you might think of it. This was perhaps more about the exploration of people, not just landscapes. But the reason I'm mentioning it here in this talk this evening is that, as I say, it was such a huge leap off the conveyor belt for me. But it remains today easily the most wonderful but most terrifying thing I've ever done. And I hope that will be some encouragement for you. Now, I did take a very formal route of taking the time out. I did it through an official out of program experience program. So it wasn't completely reckless and wild, but I did have to kind of work myself through a lot of barriers. So there were a lot of people who told me it was ridiculous, including my own supervisor, including some of my peers and other people around me. And all of this culminated in a really, really challenging conversation at the Royal College of General Practitioners with the out of program experience lead, a lovely gentleman who I won't mention the name of, who basically told me, this is far too ambitious, there's no way you'll ever do this, this is crazy, and really kind of brought me to the point of almost walking out of a conversation, which I've never done. But I held my ground and told him I was going to do it, and I did. And I have to say, the first day, so that first Wednesday in August, when you always swap over jobs, was my first day in, gosh, since the age of 3 that I hadn't been in either education or training. And it was the most terrifying day I've ever experienced. And that was all because of this fear around, you know, being unconventional, of thinking outside of the box, of not sticking to the rules. And I'm very, very happy to tell you that the story has a happy ending. And the project was a really big success. It was easily the most amazing thing I've done personally. It completely transformed my ideas of being a doctor, of what I wanted in my life. I did actually get a written apology from the chap at the RCGP, which was also very nice. I went on to present some of the work at the Wonka Worldwide GP Network Conference in South Korea. And it's obviously led to many other things for me. So yes, hope that's a little bit of encouragement to step off that conveyor belt. Okay, I'm aware I'm sort of rambling quite a lot. So let's get to the proper expedition stuff, which is, I'm sure, why you're all here. So we've talked a little bit about kind of laying a foundation for being an expedition medic and how you can think about kind of coming to that in the future. But what can I tell you about actually being on expedition and what kind of qualities are important for that? I thought I'd do that through, again, it's just my opinion, and I thought I'd do that through kind of sharing some stories from my experiences on expedition. So my first kind of lesson for you, my first kind of tip, I guess, would be that to be an expedition doctor on an expedition, you have to want to be a part of a team. Much more so than any medical job you'll have in hospital. Being part of a team is really, really crucial. And that's because on an ideal expedition, you're not going to have any medical work to do. If you do your job well, you're going to avoid any medical catastrophes. So that either means that you're sitting around not doing very much for the month, or it means that you muck in and you get involved with a team and you take on whatever role is needed. And therefore, it's really important when you take on an expedition or an opportunity to think about the kind of group that you're going with. So this is me on the photograph putting talcum powder on people's feet, which is what I spend a lot of my time doing as an expedition doctor. You get very, very close to feet a lot of the time, so make sure you're okay with that. This was an expedition for young people, so age 14 to 18, a lot of them from care backgrounds who'd never been outside of London before. So it's a really, really exciting and inspiring experience. But yeah, to go on that expedition, for example, you have to like young people, you have to want to do that kind of youth development work. Other thing about being on an expedition is that you have to muck in, and you have to sometimes be willing to do work that you didn't necessarily sign up for and perhaps isn't the most fun. This is me with some of the other crew members from the ship, the bark Europa, that I went to Antarctica on in January this year. And the corner up on the left-hand side, sorry, the picture on the left-hand side there, you can probably see me faintly in the background. I'm washing dishes in the galley, and the other ladies are demonstrating how tight the space was. So I'll talk a little bit more about Antarctica later. But yes, this was very much a trip about mucking in, being part of the crew. I spent much more time on this trip scrubbing toilets and decks than treating medical conditions. So, you know, you really have to be being flexible, being adaptable is a great quality to have an expedition medic. And remember that a lot of the people choosing you for these roles aren't going to be medics themselves. So they're really looking as much for your personality as for your medical capabilities. If you go along with your medical degree and maybe you've been on a wilderness medical training course, many people will think, great, you've got that covered, but what do you like as a person? And are you going to get on with the rest of the crew? Or are you going to get on with the young people? So really important to think about that. Who are you and what can you offer to a team? Do you play the guitar and you can entertain people at night? Are you really good at knot tying, which apparently is very important on a ship, I came to realize. So really important to think about those other skills as well. And the truth is that the nicer you are to your teammates and the more helpful you are and the more toilets you clean, it means that when the medical stuff does hit the fan, more people are going to be around you to support you. So it always pays off to be nice to people. Next lesson, be in awe of your environment. So a little bit like the team thing. If you go on an expedition or you're doing some remote work, you have to want to be in the environment that you're going to. You're going to be camping along with the participants on the expedition. You're going to be under the stars. You're going to be digging a hole and going to the toilet in the bush like everyone else. So you have to be comfortable in the environment that you're in, and you have to really, really want to be there, because that's what it's about. As the medic, often your comfort comes behind everyone else's. You're the one looking after people, checking people's feet, holding the bucket when people are seasick. So it's really important that you feel as comfortable as you can. And so that just again means having a little bit of a think about, if you get offered an opportunity, for example, in the Amazon, are you someone who you think will enjoy the jungle? Are you someone who's been at altitude before and knows what it's like, etc. So just really important to think about these things. And I'll just really quickly share a story. The previous picture where I was looking at feet was on an expedition to Iceland with British Exploring Society. And they actually asked me to do 2 expeditions back to back, but I couldn't do both. And so the doctor they got on the next trip, I later heard was a retired surgeon who'd come along, and I think was hoping to do more bird watching than anything else. Which hated the environment, hated the young people, didn't bring any walking boots, didn't bring a warm jacket, and just had a really, really miserable time. So again, it's just really important to make sure you want to be on that trip as our participant first and a medic second. Okay, this would be pretty obvious what this is. So this is me swimming in Antarctica on my birthday this year. And telling someone before we started the talk that I've taken up wild swimming this year. This remains the coldest I've ever been, but it was pretty exhilarating. So the point that this photo illustrates is the need definitely to be bold when it comes to expedition medicine. So as I said to you kind of at the beginning around medical school and foundation years, you'll feel quite a lot of pressure, I think, to, especially as an F1, to take on tasks that you don't necessarily feel ready to do. There's always an element of that in medicine, and you get used to it and you're okay. When taking on really big challenges, it is important to feel competent to do it, obviously. Pushing yourself unnecessarily out of your comfort zone is not a great idea. But it's also important to be a bit brave and take that step, because, you know, when I was asked to join a trip to Antarctica, I'd never been to Antarctica before. I'd never been on a sailing ship for so long before. So it was going to be very difficult for me to give a completely informed answer to that question. So it did take a really huge leap of faith. It took me having to say to myself, I do know what I'm doing in terms of medicine. I think I can handle most things. This is really terrifying, but I'm just going to go for it. And I'd really encourage you all just to take that first step. So many people say to me, my peers say to me, oh, we could just never do what you do. And they could, but sometimes it just takes saying to yourself that you can and just getting there and getting on with it. Now, Antarctica in the Europa is such a great example of that for me. It was definitely the biggest yes I've ever said to anything. And that came about because I basically started cold calling them about 2 years ago, desperate to get on board. They're a Dutch ship, the ship is Dutch. And I called their office about 2 years ago and said, I'm a doctor, I'm really keen to come on one of your trips, please have me. Called quite a few times, they were very nice. But I never in a million years thought they would offer me anything. And I certainly didn't think they would offer me a trip to Antarctica. So when they called me in October last year, it was an incredible moment, but also a terrifying one, but definitely one that I knew I had to say yes to after all of that. So be aware of the skill set required. This is quite an important point, I think, maybe for you guys at your stage and maybe a bit later on when you're thinking about which specialty you might go into. So again, only speaking from my small experience of expedition medicine, I found that a lot of the skill set wasn't quite what I thought it was going to be. You know, I imagined it would be all high drama, high octane emergencies, rushing here, there, and here, there, and everywhere. And what I found actually is that a lot of it is like being a GP. You basically have your GP community, and you're with them all the time. So there's a lot of blister care, looking at feet, a lot of general aches and pains, sprained ankles, tummy pain, etc. And there's actually also a lot of mental health increasingly, particularly working with kind of vulnerable groups like young people, people with special needs, etc. So just something to be aware of. I wouldn't want anyone to be put off doing something like expedition medicine because they feel like they're not an adrenaline junkie, or they don't necessarily want to do anesthetics or whatever. There will be emergency stuff. And if you go into those kind of fields, you're very, very good at that side of it. And it's absolutely the right thing to do. But there are many, many trips that you can go on where other skills are a little bit more important. So as long as you know your kind of resuscitation guidelines and things, the majority of your work is going to be a bit more mundane than that. But that's why I quite like it. You've got to be really comfortable managing uncertainty in remote environments on expedition. And again, many of you will know this already. Eleanor was telling me that she's done the remote medicine course. This is what you get taught on these kind of courses all the time. And certain careers, again, kind of set you up better for that. So I would say that GP, A&E, roles where you're already managing that uncertainty quite regularly do put you in a kind of good position to do it on expedition. And it really kind of has to alter your thresholds for things. I'll give you an example of managing a girl with a suspected appendicitis in Iceland. We were about 6 hours drive away from a hospital, so not too remote, but reasonably. And I definitely sort of sat on her longer than I would have done at home in kind of a London general practice, probably 24 hours longer than I would have done. And in the end sent her in because the pain was very bad. As it happened, she was fine, but it was definitely the right thing to do. So it just, your sort of parameters and thresholds have to adapt and change a little bit. And this is where being part of that team is really important, because you are often making big decisions about, does the expedition need to stop? Does someone need to be evacuated? So you're really relying on relationships between the teams and everyone communicating really well. Again, this picture is in Iceland, actually. I'm wearing a head net against the flies. It's a little bit of an odd picture without explaining that. And I can probably give you quite a good example from Iceland of, again, managing uncertainty. This picture is actually during a sort of field clinic when there were two groups who were crossing a sort of lava field, and we kind of met in the middle, miles away from base camp, from anywhere else. And the other group came to me and said, oh, this young person has chest pain. So I examined this boy and he seemed completely fine, chest sounded fine. And then I sort of a bit stupidly decided to put a SATS monitor on him. and found he had oxygen sats of 84%. And then I was really screwed. And I was sitting thinking, what can be going on that he would have sats of 84? You know, why would this guy have a PE? Or, you know, it's crazy. But obviously it was really, really worrying, and I was just really wishing I hadn't looked and I didn't know. So I sat there for a while, and all the teams were like trying to get going, and so in the end I just sort of had to think, well, I think the chances of this being anything significant in a 15-year-old are so slim. I'm just gonna go and let him go and just check in and hope that it's okay. He went, he was fine. We got a different SATS monitor that night, and his SATS were 99. So I think it was a machine as it happened. But it was just a little bit of a lesson of those thresholds having to change a little bit. To be honest, I probably, if that happened again, wouldn't check a 15-year-old SATS in that situation. So there are a few things that can really help. So I've probably been a bit scary and kind of describing these very uncertain, scary situations, but there's lots that you can do as an expedition doctor to make it easier for yourself. And the first thing is to be as prepared as you can. And again, if you're thinking about a career in expedition medicine, and you're sitting listening, just have a little bit of a think at the moment of how prepared I am in my normal life. How good am I at being kind of organized and prepared? Because it is really important, unfortunately, in this kind of work. So the key to it, and again, anyone who's done kind of remote medical learning will know, the key to kind of being on expedition is to prevent. So the more you know up front and the more you prevent things from happening, the less you have to deal with in the field, which is better for everyone. And I didn't really realize that I was quite kind of micromanagey until I went on the expedition to Iceland with the British Exploring Society. And I actually produced, you can see on the left-hand side, a guide to staying healthy and happy whilst on expedition. So I produced this big kind of booklet to give to all the kids before we went. Now the British Exploring Society was super impressed by that and actually nominated me for an award for doing this. But I didn't want to tell them that actually the reason I did this was because I was so worried about going and so desperate to give as much information to them before as possible to minimize, you know, what I would have to deal with, that was the reason I'd done it. But they obviously saw it as being, you know, incredibly organized, and yeah, it all went down very well. Second thing, in terms of making scary and uncertainty easier, this is probably the most important advice I'll give you this evening. I know I've said that a few times now, but this would definitely be it. Be humble. So be humble as a doctor, be humble as a human being. It's a word we kind of throw around a lot, but it is so important when you go into slightly precarious situations. This photo is of me being rescued from 30 meters up on a tall ship mast in Antarctica. I just completely froze out of fear. I didn't realize I had a fear of heights until I was on the second platform up this mast and had to be sort of supported and helped. I did actually make it to the third platform and then was helped down. But the point of it is that, particularly in my journey to Antarctica, taught me that if you don't go into a situation willing to learn and willing to admit when you don't know things, you're unlikely to do very well in it. If you go in with an ego that you know everything, yeah, as I say, you're unlikely to have a good experience. This seemed like a really good moment to tell you a little bit about Antarctica. I'm just going to check the time. So again, I'm just going to show you a little bit of a video of the ship that I was on, the Europa in Antarctica. Just going to leave that there. It's one of my favorite photographs. So yeah, it's probably a good time just to very briefly tell you a bit about Antarctica, because it's certainly, in terms of expedition and wilderness and remote medicine, the most exciting thing I've done. And it's the trip that everyone always wants to hear about, and it probably deserves an entire talk in itself another time maybe. But to give you a quick overview, I was asked, as I say, to join a month-long voyage to Antarctica, leaving from Argentina, crossing the Drake Passage, spending 2.5 weeks sailing down the Antarctic Peninsula, and then back up and crossing back to Argentina. The bark Europa is a tall ship from the 1900s, so very old sailing ship. And she goes to Antarctica every year and spends the rest of the year sort of circumnavigating the globe. On board, there were about 60 of us, so half were what we call voyage crew, so people who'd paid to come on the trip and learn to sail as well as go to Antarctica, and the other 30 or so were permanent crew, so proper sailors who did this for a living. It really was the most amazing experience in terms of travel for me. But as I kind of mentioned, it was also really challenging in many, many ways. And actually, I'd say the least challenging part was probably in the medical aspects, of which there were a few that I'll tell you about. But probably the most challenging thing was being thrown into a situation where I really, in many ways, didn't know what I was doing. I'd grown up, as I said, dinghy sailing. I'd been yacht sailing a few times, but transposing that to a tall ship was completely different. So I had to get used to very early on being told what to do a lot of the time, being told I was doing things wrong a lot of the time, being told at times I didn't even know how to clean a toilet, if you can believe it. And I don't think you'll mind me saying, as a medic, that can be quite hard because we get very used to knowing what we're doing, especially as a GP, where you work very independently. So to begin with, it was really tough having to accept that, you know, I wasn't very good at a lot of the things that I was required to do. And it took a lot of humility to get over that and to ask for help and to be willing to learn. And it radically transformed my experience when I was able to do that. One of the biggest things, obviously, for any sailing expedition is seasickness. And these photos are all taken in the Drake. So the one on the left-hand side that was the kind of degree angle of tilt of the corridor. That's the ship in the middle, obviously. And the map is a map of this bit of water that lies between Argentina and Antarctica. It's the most notorious bit of water in the world for really kind of rough, bad weather. So I was a little bit worried about it, as you can imagine. Now, as that happens, the weather we got was pretty good. So I'm told, but I was unfortunately still sick, as were half of the people on board. And again, I would say this was a real lesson in humility, that, you know, nothing has ever felt quite as humble as throwing up into a bucket alongside a bunch of people you've literally 24 hours before been counselling about seasickness. So that took eating humble pie, being one of the thrower-uppers, and just kind of getting on with it. My final lesson of humility from Antarctica, and this was the kind of medical situation that we had. Again, in Antarctica, most of the work for me was pretty mundane, seasickness, stomachache, that kind of thing, pretty kind of easy. We did have one incident which was slightly more dramatic, and I'll tell you about that now. So this is Manny. He was 70 and the oldest member of the voyage crew on board, had been saving up for a long time to come on this trip. And unfortunately, after 5 days of sailing in the Drake Passage, we were landing on Antarctica on the peninsula for the first time, and Manny fell. I wasn't with him at the time, and I was called by radio to come back really quickly. So I kind of scramble over, and Manny's lying on the ground, blood coming out of his head, and one of his fingers sort of bent at an angle like this, with bone obviously sticking out. So he had an open fracture. It's really nice speaking to medics because I can give all these details without worrying anyone's going to pass out in the audience. So a bit of bone, bit of chunk of bone sticking out, not looking great. So in my mind, I had my little medical kit there, And in my mind, I was sort of working myself up to thinking, you know, I'm going to have to obviously straighten his finger. And I'm sort of explaining to him, you know, on autopilot, you know, your nerve supply, etc., blood supply might be compromised. I'd need to straighten the finger. And, you know, I'd maybe done this a few times in A&E many years ago. So a little bit nervous, but I was sort of working myself up to it, thinking, right, I'm just going to just do it. Come on. And as I did that, someone came swooping over my left-hand shoulder. And she happened to be one of the other voyage crew on board, a paying guest, who was also a German anaesthetist who'd worked in many war zones. So she comes swooping in and without saying anything, grabs his finger and straightens it right in front of me. Now, some doctors, some medics in that situation might be a little bit, you know, put out and sort of think, you know, you've taken my moment of glory. I was just about to do that. You know, how dare you kind of waltz in? And I was not like that. I was very, very grateful for her help in that moment. I, of course, would have done it myself. But, you know, her expertise and her support, both then and later with other things, was really appreciated. And my ego wasn't too big that I couldn't accept that help, and I couldn't learn from her. She was a really fantastic medic, and we worked very well together. I will say that the daily cleaning of that wound and worrying about it was left to me. Unfortunately, she was no longer involved. But I'm happy to say that Manny is alive and well today, as is his finger. So again, a really good example of being kind of humble, accepting your limitations when it comes to medicine, getting help if you need it, although I hadn't asked, but I was happy that it arrived. And as it turned out, that was a really good experience in my thresholds, involved, you know, explaining to him the risks of him staying on board, covering with the broadest spectrum antibiotic I had, speaking to a remote medical team, which I had to do by law, and kind of juggling that all with the captain and the team and making that group decision. And it was, yeah, a bad thing to happen, but it was a very good experience for me. So I am coming to the end, I promise. So one of the final things that Eleanor asked me to talk about, she gave me sort of suggestions, and I think I've probably ambitiously tried to answer it all. One of the things that she asked me was, how do you combine a career in medicine with a life of adventure? And I think I've sort of, through some of those points, kind of covered a little bit of the nitty-gritty of that. But the main message in terms of that would be, the secret is medicine is your ticket to adventure. It's your passport to adventure. Medicine is an amazing career in and of itself. And I think all of us are here because we like talking to people, I hope, and we want to help people, etc. We enjoy the science behind it. Whatever you put on your UCAS form, I'm sure holds true. And that's true. And I think it's certainly for me, not just about the amazing places I can get to. It's about, I love being a doctor and I love having that role. But it is also your ticket to these places. And there are just reams and reams of opportunities out there if you grab them. I will say to people, medicine's taken me up mountains, it's taken me literally across oceans now. And it's also through the mental health research introduced me to people around the world that I never would have met before. So what does my life look like now? These are just some photos that I found to put together rather casually. But on the kind of left-hand side there, still doing a lot of research. The project I told you about has led to doing more research. And most recently, I was in the US last year working with Indigenous healers, Native American healers, looking at using traditional practice in managing mental health and whether any of that might be respectfully transferred to a Western population. So I've just published a report on that. And then obviously other pictures, still doing some expeditions, hoping to be out again with British Exploring Society next year. And I'm happy to tell you a little bit more about the organisations I've worked with in the question time. I also am a mental health trainer, as Eleanor said. I work for a company called For Mental Health, and we do mental health and suicide response training for other GPs and mental health care workers. I also do a bit of GP as well, not as much as maybe the other things, but I love, at the end of the day, I love being a doctor, and I would never not want to be a doctor, but I knew from an early age that I needed other things in my life as well. So as I say, the secret is medicine can give you the life that you want, but it really is up to you to carve it out yourself, to make that life that you want for yourself. The rest of the time, I spend a lot of my time, weirdly, going to weird places around the world and playing the ukulele. That seems to have become a bit of a theme when I look back at my photographs. And I occasionally sleep as well, but only for a short time. Thank you very much for listening. Please fire away with questions if you have any.
Thank you so much. Yeah, that was a really incredible talk. I really enjoyed it. I'm sure everyone did as well. I think you've got a feedback form as well.
Yeah,
so we can all show how grateful we are basically for this talk by filling that in as well. I especially liked just how you went over kind of thinking about priorities in life and flexibility within your career, touched on like the conveyor belt of medicine and everything, which I think we all definitely feel. And yeah, taking risks and going to speak to the Royal College of GP, I found that story really interesting. And yeah, just like the opportunities that can come across if you just call people as well, and especially your points about humility, which I think everyone within medicine it's applicable to, and really useful. So yeah, thank you so much. I think there's a few questions in the chat, so maybe if I ask them to you, and if anyone wants to ask a question directly, just raise your hand and then we can come to you, and I can let you unmute your mic and you can ask it. I think that'll be quite nice. Okay, so we had some questions. Chloe was asking, do you need to be particularly strong for a career in this field? She says she loves travel and medicine, but might not be the strongest person out there.
Oh, as in physically strong.
I think it means physically strong. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I'm not. I'm not that strong. No, I mean, being on the ship actually was the first time where I did feel my physical presence was quite, necessary. But no, I mean, obviously, if you're on an expedition where you're trekking up a mountain, you need to be able to get up the mountain, and it looks quite bad if you're the medic and you're kind of at the back. So what I'd say is, like I said in a talk, think about when you take an opportunity about whether you would want to do that yourself, not just as a medic, but as a participant on that expedition. If you're interested in getting fit and getting up mountains, then go and do it. If it's not something you think you'd enjoy, then it's not for you. But no, in terms of being physically strong, no, I wouldn't let that put you off. There are many opportunities that don't require actual kind of brute force.
Yeah, definitely. I think there's something about being prepared for whatever environment you're going to. So making sure if you're going to altitude that you're comfortable with that, and cold weather if you're comfortable with that. Next question was, are there any health requirements you need in terms of fitness? Do you need initial training? So I guess similar line of thought. Yeah,
I mean, no one's ever asked me, if I'm honest. I think people generally assume as the medic you'll be fine. So again, I would say it's your responsibility really to make sure you're up to it. I mean, on the ship there were kind of health restrictions for the participants, so I imagine if I hadn't have been able to do, they were very simple, like can you pull yourself out of a hatch and things. It would have been a problem if I couldn't do it, but no one's ever asked me to do a fitness test or anything like that.
Next question, I'm not sure if anyone can answer this, but it's, how is COVID going to impact on opportunities?
Yeah, well, it has, unfortunately. So I was British Exploring Society, for example, have had to cancel all their expeditions this year. The Bark Europa that I was on Antarctica with have cancelled their season this year. So yes, I mean, COVID has impacted them because of travel, obviously, and groups working together. But you know, this work's so important. I'm sure when we can, trips like this will be back on. So again, I wouldn't let that put you off pursuing.
So next question is advice for a second year medic who wants to do things like sailing, but the societies are really expensive. Any advice for gaining the skills to make you stand out or enjoy the outdoors?
Yeah, it's a really, really good point. I think sailing was quite expensive when I was at St Andrews as well. I remember that being a bit of a hindrance. There are other ways. I mean, I don't know about your area, but if you look at things like Meetup, for example, there are often groups that offer places for particular sailing crew. So if you guys, I don't know where you're from, Chloe, but if you are on the coast, I think there are quite a lot of opportunities out there just to maybe join a boat for a weekend. Or so the good thing about sailing is that people who sail yachts are often looking for crew. So it might be worth just having a look, as I say, kind of meet up, asking at your local sailing club if anyone's looking for a crew, or if you can do a taster. And just thinking again a little bit outside the box of kind of university societies, and there's probably ways of getting experience, gaining skills to make you stand out. As I say, I mean, certain companies will look that you've done things like expedition medicine courses, so it is probably wise to do at least something along those lines. But otherwise, as I say, it's really about personality. It's about what can you bring to a team. I have this kind of slightly strange thing that I do quite a lot of Scottish country dancing, and on every trip I've been on, I've taught them a Scottish country dance. I'm not sure that got me the job, but it definitely kind of builds connections. So yeah, make sure you've covered your bases. So you're a good medic, you're aware of the skills required, you've proven that you can do it. And then above and beyond that, it's really about, why do you want me on this expedition rather than someone else?
The next question is about language barriers. I don't know if you've come across, you've had to learn any languages as you've gone through or anything.
No, I haven't. I mean, the Europa, as I say, was a Dutch ship, so the crew were very international, but English was the main spoken language. So no, for me, I haven't, but I do know certain companies, British Exploring, for example, do an expedition to the Amazon every year where they quite like it if their leaders can speak Spanish. So again, that might be a skill that gives you a bit of an advantage.
Marta's asked, how did you select the countries that you visited or the communities?
Yeah, and a good question. So during that project, I was looking for communities that were geographically and culturally diverse. So I chose Orkney because I was looking for a community within the UK that was sort of the most remote community I could find. And I ended up on an island of 400 people. Sorry. I ended up on an island of 400 people with one GP, and it certainly met those requirements. And then after that, it was really, as I say, just about diversity and communities that I had connections with. So I had a lot of connections in the US. I managed to make a connection through the RCGP actually in Japan. And the RCGP then actually funded me after all that to go to Japan. They gave me a scholarship. So that kind of ended up quite nice. And then Norway, again, I was looking for a Scandinavian country because I was interested in their healthcare system and particularly their sort of mental health stats and things like that. So it was a little bit random, but kind of fell into place.
Okay. Jamie's asked, do you think expedition medicine is a viable career in the long term in terms of fitting around other life events, or a temporary vocation before settling down?
Sure, yeah, really good question. So I personally think it is a very viable career, but then I'm someone who I can't really ever imagine sort of settling down. You know, I personally think your life is what you make of it. Obviously, there are times when you've got a mortgage or kids, or that you have to think about those things. But the people that I really admire and who I've got to know through this work are people who are still doing it, even in those situations. And you just find a way. So I don't know if you know a Dr. Lucy Oblensky. I'd really recommend looking her up. So she's involved with the Exeter course. And she is one of my heroes in this world, and you know, has a family and but still does all her expedition stuff. So yes, I think it is viable, but it's really dependent on you. You know, if you're someone who wants to buy a house and stay in one place, then it's probably not. But if you're someone who's willing to be a bit flexible, take some time out from a partner or whatever, then yes, I think it is. Yeah.
Someone's asked about are there any difficulties with health insurance and visas and stuff, or is that a complication to the process?
Yeah, the only the only issue can be indemnity insurance. So health insurance, no, if you're young and fit, but it can be difficult being covered insurance wise. And so in Antarctica, actually, I had issues with that. And it was only the day that we set off from Argentina that I got insurance, which was a bit dodgy. So often your kind of MDU, NPS won't cover really extreme stuff. So that is something to think of. But there are a lot of private companies out there now that do. So again, there are ways and means. But what I would say on that note is it's, again, really important to think about the opportunity that come your way. So make sure you're going with a company that's reputable, make sure you're happy with their safety measures, because what you don't want is to end up in a situation that you're not happy with health and safety wise, where you end up in problems and then you can't really back yourself to insurers. So someone like British Exploring Society, for example, have a really good reputation. I'd really encourage getting in touch with them. Or someone like them, and just especially for your first trip, being with a company that you trust is really important.
Maria's asked, thinking about foundation year, are there any deaneries where it's easier to get expedition medicine experiences or the necessary skill set? I don't know if you have any insight into that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't really, other than, as I say, I know the sort of Peninsula, so the Exeter link, I think they're Peninsula, aren't they? They actually have a dedicated course, and I would just assume that deaneries that are have more access to the outdoors would probably be a better bet. I did F1 and F2 in Bath, as I said. I mean, there probably wasn't a lot there in terms of opportunities. I kind of made my own opportunities. But yeah, there probably, I'd say, kind of going to kind of Devon, Cornwall, and that kind of, there probably is more that you could get involved in terms of that.
Next question is about one about money and pay and kind of, is it like fully paid like I guess a normal job as a doctor?
Yeah, really, really good question. So most expeditions now aren't paid. So for example, haven't been paid actually to do any of the stuff I've done expedition wise. Antarctica, I went as a volunteer, so it meant that I got to go on that trip for free, which was pretty amazing. But yes, it's a month out of paid work. So again, that's quite important when you're thinking of career choice, because I knew that I needed a job that I could locum, and that the locum work would pay me enough to do these trips. So it's just something to think about. There's not much expedition work now that pays, and they kind of expect most people to do it voluntarily. So that is something to obviously think about.
Yeah, I guess people are sometimes paying thousands to go on these trips, so it's kind of very good to get on it for free as well.
It is, yeah, and most of us will end up in a job where we can afford to do it, but it's just the choice whether you want to or not.
Jordan's asked whether a fear of heights is an issue in considering expedition medicine.
I don't think so, because I'm doing it, and apparently I have a fear of heights, but I didn't know that. No, I don't think so. Again, it depends what you're doing. I mean, I think, you know, if you're high going, you know, scaling Himalayas and things, it's something to think about if you don't like heights. But for example, being on the ship, it didn't matter. I didn't actually have to go up the mast if I didn't want to. I just chose to and got a bit stuck. So no, I don't think it matters, no.
Joe's asked, how do you recommend going about finding jobs, and are there any kind of key agencies to get involved with?
Yeah, so there are various ways of finding jobs. It's a bit of a kind of network, as you can imagine. So it's sort of about not necessarily knowing the right people, but just finding out about opportunities. So again, it's another reason I'd encourage you to maybe go on one of the WMT courses, because that's where I met Lucy, for example, and you just get to know people in the field. If you make kind of a good impression, someone might think of you. So do a little bit of that. Be authentic, be yourself, but put that time in. And then otherwise, there are various kind of forums. So I can do a list to kind of send to you guys afterwards, but there's things like Adventure Medics, other kind of groups like that post jobs. There's obviously not a huge amount of that going on at the moment. And then in terms of agencies, again, I would recommend people like British Exploring Society, the Youth Adventure Trust. Rally is another group that does kind of reputable, they've been working in the field for a long time. I believe a lot of people start off by doing kind of trips up Kilimanjaro and things with charities, which is fine. I would just, as I say, make sure you know who the charity are, you're comfortable. And something I didn't really mention in the talk, but something I'm always really specific on is that I've had enough time to screen people before, that I'm happy with the conditions that they have, and etc. So as I say, when you get on a trip, it kind of ends up being your responsibility. So you need to make sure you're happy. So yeah, so as I say, I can have a think about that and do a list for you guys if that would be useful.
I was just going to mention, do you have a link to your feedback form?
I do, yeah. Shall I put it in the chat?
Yeah, just before, I'm thinking if people are heading off during the Q&A, it's best to catch them now.
Yeah, I'd really appreciate that, guys. Thank you. It's just a few, just little notes. I was telling Eleanor, I've done a few talks recently to different people, and it's just, yeah, about knowing whether there's anything you would like that I missed out or whatever. Thank you. Any other?
So if everyone could fill in that, that would be really helpful.
Appreciate that, thank you.
So the next question is, does being an expedition medic have an impact on family life?
Yes, I mean, this goes back to what we've said before. I mean, being transparent, so I'm in a relationship with someone long distance who is in a similar, he's not a medic, but a similar line of work. So for us, it kind of works really well. But, you know, realistically, you do have to think about, if you're with someone who is very much at home and their job's here, are you going to be able to go away? And of course, that's potentially going to impact. As I say, I would like to think there's always ways of working around that, but that's something that you need to think about. It's another reason to think about the career choice that you make as well, because certain careers like GP make that a little bit easier, because you can be a bit more flexible and you can maybe get your time other places with somebody. Potentially, if you're going into something like surgery or something where you're going to be very committed for a long time, it means that little bit of time you do have, if you're then running off to the Himalayas on your own, that's potentially not going to work with having a family. So as I say, I mean, I don't know that I can really answer that. I can only say personally how it's impacted me, I guess.
Helen is asking, do you have any advice for someone with similar interests with regards to planning your elective, or where you could go for help in planning it?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't really. I mean, you could obviously do all kinds of things on an elective. I suppose I would, again, think back to the qualities that will stand you in good stead for the future, and think about, for example, I would suggest going somewhere quite remote. So whether that's, I know of friends, for example, who went to kind of mountain stations in Nepal for their elective and were working with mountaineers and climbers and that in that kind of environment. So thinking about maybe getting a bit of remote experience, potentially kind of pre-hospital immediate care experience. So if you're maybe in this country doing some time with HEMS or the air ambulance, or that kind of stuff. But also, your elective is just such a great time to experience something different, that, as I keep saying, I wouldn't worry too much about if I don't do something specific for expedition medicine, I won't get there. I mean, I went to a little village in Tanzania and it was great, really mind-blowing and eye-opening and all the rest of it. So I would just do something you want to do something that feels right for you, and the likelihood it will lead you to kind of where you want to be. So I wouldn't worry too much about tailoring it for something.
Okay. Alice has asked a few things. She said, "Hi, thanks for such an inspiring talk. I wondered how you came across opportunities to join expeditions." I think we've covered a bit of that before. Do they fund your kit? And how do you choose what to take? Also, do the courses teach you topics such as wound dressing, blister care, sickness? She feels like this isn't covered in medical school.
Yeah, it's not, is it? I'm glad you said that. Yeah, so how do I come across opportunities? Yeah, we've kind of covered that a bit. So there are message boards, there are people who will get in touch with you, and then there's a lot of just being proactive. So as I say, I had to cold call the Bug Europa a few times. So it's worth just having a look around and speaking to people and getting some ideas. But I will put a list together for you guys. How do you fund your kit? I've had to buy all my own kit, but it's kind of a good investment because it means you can go on other trips with it. Antarctica was quite expensive in terms of that, but again, it was worth it for me. How do you pick what to take? Again, that's sort of a bit about being humble. So the first time I went with British Exploring, the chief leader gave me a lot of advice on what to take and how to pack my bag. And, I'd done camping trips before, but I'd never been out for so long. So again, it's about just admitting if you don't know that stuff, and that's okay. You're not expected to be a chief leader. You're just expected to be a medic who's able to walk up the mountain. So I would just kind of ask the rest of your team. Yeah, so wilderness medical training teach you on the Chamonix course, you do things like trauma assessment, you do kind of a bit of like tropical medicine, what else, kind of fracture care, a bit of wound stuff, but it's a really, really good point. And what I'd recommend is maybe looking out for those kind of courses. So for example, the RCGP do minor wound, minor injury courses. I actually sat with my practice nurse for a couple of sessions before I went to Antarctica, just to kind of get a recap on dressings, because I knew the kit that I was getting on the ship. So again, it's always really important to know the medical kit that's going to be available to you. Sorry, that's probably what Alice meant actually about the kit. So the medical kit is normally supplied by the company you're going with, but you get say on what's in it usually. So it's really important to make sure you're happy with all of that. Make sure you know what everything is, how to use it. So yeah, so if you know there's a bunch of dressings, for example, like burns dressings, just kind of look up how to use them before you get out there. Spend a bit of time. Other places are urgent care centres, minor injury units in A&E. It's possible just to go and get a bit of work experience in there. Yeah, but a lot of expedition medicine is just common sense, to be honest. A lot of it is people asking you, what happens when I ate this? Or I don't want to shower, is that a problem? It's just about being a bit parental as well, which can be a bit difficult.
Megan's asked, did you have any extra non-medical skills to help get jobs, such as navigation, like rope tying, mountain leader qualifications, or anything like that?
So I don't have a mountain leader qualification, but I have thought about getting one. I think things like that would give you an advantage. Yeah, I don't think it's required, but I think I'm sure if someone looked at you and were like, oh, you can really do the outdoorsy stuff as well. Yes. When I first applied to British Exploring, they did ask me about what outdoor experience I had and why I wanted to be in the outdoors. And so I was able to say trips that I'd done and things. So yes, I think you have to show that you want to be on an expedition as well as you know how to dress a wound. And yeah, like navigation, tying knot, absolutely. If it's, but make sure it's stuff you're interested in. I wouldn't say go and do a bunch of courses you don't care about. But if you're kind of interested in sailing and want to learn to do some knots, believe me, on the Europa, that would help you out because it's quite tough learning it on the job. So yes, I would recommend doing that kind of stuff.
Chloe's asked, do you personally use the Wilderness Medicine Oxford Handbook at all?
Yeah, so I actually took that with me to Antarctica and I didn't open it, but I do think it's good. Yeah, I do think it's good. I read it quite a bit before I went, and I would like to think if I was in a situation, I would probably, and I didn't know what to do, I think there would have been some information in there that would have been useful. And remember, in a lot of these places you don't have internet, so I didn't have internet on the ship at all. So that was a little bit scary because we're so used to it now. So having a really good kind of guide that you trust is good. And actually Wilderness Medical Training give you a guide when you go on their course, and I found that really useful as well.
Okay, there's one, I think this will be our last question that we'll finish on, and because you've answered so many already. So the last question is, have you ever felt out of your depth?
Have you ever felt out of my depth? Yes, but it's been okay. Yeah, when I think of some of the things, I mean, as I say, I've been lucky that nothing terrible has happened. I've spoken to a few of the other doctors who've been to Antarctica, and they've had some pretty dramatic things happen. But I've never felt like I couldn't handle something. But I've certainly, when the chap sort of had an open fracture on his finger and I was cleaning it, I was sort of thinking, oh, I don't quite know exactly. I'm not 100% that one thing is better than the other. And that took just a bit of thinking about and just, you know, a little chat with myself. So yeah, I felt scared at times, but I've never felt, you just basically go back to your ABC and, you know, it's okay. I've never felt like I couldn't handle a situation, but that may still happen. I don't know.
Thank you so much for answering all those questions in such detail, and I think everyone here can agree it was a fantastic talk, and so nice to hear something so aspirational amongst all the doom and gloom nowadays as well. And yeah, we've had such a great turnout today, kind of 60 people still here listening, and there was around 110 at the most, which stayed really high the whole way through the talk. So yeah, it was a fantastic opportunity for everyone. I'm just gonna share a slide for people who want to contact BSMS Wilderness Medicine Society. So we're a student-led society at Brighton and Sussex Medical School. This is our Facebook, Instagram and email. It's all Wilderness BSMS. So you can keep up with any of our future events there. I'm the current president of the society, and we're hoping to organise webinars similar to this throughout the year. So definitely check out our pages so you can keep up with all of those. And yeah, just really thank you, Dr. Sophie Redlin. It was really a really amazing talk. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you again for having me. And as I say, do fill out the feedback, and if you do want to reach out with any other questions, just wing me a message on Twitter or Instagram or whatever. I'm more than happy to help in any way I can.
And we'll share the link to the feedback on the event page too for anyone that's missed it. I'll just make sure that I've copied. Okay, thank you all for attending, and thank you, Dr. Sophie Redlin.
All right, take care everyone. Thanks for having me.